December 2024, Montana Rockies, altitude 11,000 feet. In 1983, when the Soviet Union still cast its shadow across the world and America's enemies wore uniforms, you could see they built something in these mountains. A fortress, a listening post, a last line of defense against an invasion that never came. The men who built it swore it would never be needed again. They were wrong. The CH-47 Chinook fought the wind like a prize fighter in the 12th round. Every gust slammed against the fuselage with enough force to rattle teeth. Below Forward Operating Base Sentinel clung to the mountainside a cluster of prefabricated structures and reinforced bunkers drab green against endless white. The kind of place where survival wasn't guaranteed, where comfort was a myth, where only the mission mattered. Inside the cargo bay, Sergeant Mike Reeves watched the new arrival. 48 years old, Gulf War veteran, Bronze Star recipient. Reeves had seen enough replacements to know the types. The cocky ones who thought they were bulletproof. The scared ones who jumped at shadows. The competent ones who kept their heads down and did their jobs. This one was different. She sat alone on the bench seat, hands resting on her knees. A simple olive drab duffel at her feet. She wore contractor fatigues, no rank, no insignia, no unit patches. Just a name tape that read Cortez in faded black letters. The collar of her weatherproof jacket was pulled high against the cold. Her face remained in shadow. But it was her stillness that caught his attention. While everyone else braced against the turbulence, grabbing overhead straps and safety rails, she simply sat. A pocket of absolute calm in the violent chaos. Lieutenant Derek Hayes sat across from Reeves, scrolling through his tablet despite the rough ride. 28 years old, never deployed, never seen combat, never earned anything except his college degree and his commission. He glanced up at the woman, then back to his screen. His lip curled slightly. "That's her," Hayes shouted over the rotor screen. "The tech liaison from Stratcom." Reeves nodded. Hayes snorted. "Command's really scraping the barrel now. She looks like a strong breeze would knock her over." He paused, then added with practiced disdain, "Hope she knows how to use a keyboard without breaking a nail." Reeves said nothing, but his eyes stayed on the woman. There was something in the way she held herself. The economy of movement, the absolute lack of wasted energy. He'd seen it before in operators, in people who'd learned that survival meant control. That panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. The ramp began to lower with a hydraulic groan. Arctic wind blasted into the bay, a wall of frigid air and stinging ice crystals that hit like a physical blow. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 3 seconds. The woman stood. No hesitation, no bracing herself. She simply rose, shouldered her duffel in one fluid motion, and walked toward the ramp, into the maelstrom. The rotor wash created a vortex of snow and wind that would have staggered most people. She leaned into it at exactly the right angle. Her body adjusted to the force like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Like the wind was an old acquaintance she'd learned to dance with. Reeves and Hayes followed, pulling their goggles down, hunching against the cold. The air at this altitude was thin enough to make your lungs burn, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The kind of environment that tested you every moment of every day. The woman Cortez stood at the edge of the landing pad, her back to them, her head turning slowly, methodically, scanning the perimeter of the base. It wasn't the look of a lost newcomer trying to orient herself. It was the measured predatory gaze of someone conducting a tactical assessment. Her eyes tracked the automated defense turrets mounted on the corners of the compound, noted the sagging camouflage netting over the fuel depot torn in 3 places, flapping uselessly in the wind. Observed the guards in the watchtowers hunched against the cold, more focused on their own discomfort than the jagged horizon beyond. She cataloged it all in seconds. Silent, professional, complete. "Hey!" Hayes shouted, his voice thin against the wind. "You Cortez!" She turned. The face that emerged from the jacket's shadow was severe. Sharp angles and hard lines. A woman in her early 30s, but with eyes that looked older. Much older. Pale gray eyes that held no warmth. Only a deep, unsettling stillness. Those eyes swept over Hayes's polished lieutenant bars, over Reeves' weathered sergeant stripes. No flicker of deference. No change in expression whatsoever. "I am," she said. Her voice was low. clear. It carried easily over the dying whine of the helicopter's turbines despite its softness. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Lieutenant Hayes," he announced, puffing his chest slightly. "This is Sergeant Reeves. We're your escort to the command center." He turned without waiting for acknowledgement, expecting her to follow like an obedient civilian contractor. "Try to keep up." She didn't move. Hayes walked 10 paces before he realized she wasn't behind him. He turned back, the irritation flashing across his face. She stood exactly where she'd been, her gaze now fixed on the primary communications array, a massive satellite dish pointed at the bleak, indifferent sky. Reeves watched her study it, watched the slight narrowing of her eyes, the tiny movement of her head as she calculated angles only she could see. "Problem?" he asked. His tone was cautious. Not hostile, just curious. "Your primary uplink is off by 3 degrees, she stated, not looking at him, still focused on the dish. "You're losing approximately 40% of your signal integrity. It's causing micro delays in your data bursts." Hayes stopped walking, turned fully around, stared at her. "Excuse me?" "In a fire item," she continued, her tone flat and matter-of-fact, devoid of any need to impress. "That's the difference between real-time targeting solutions and posthumous medals." Hayes's face flushed. "That's so? And you figured that out just by looking at it from 100 meters away in a snowstorm?" "I don't need to be closer." She finally looked at them. Those pale gray eyes settled on Hayes like a sniper's scope finding its target. "The ice accumulation on the northwestern actuator arm is uneven," she said, "creating torque drag, pulling the dish off its azimuth track by 0.03 radians." She paused. Basic physics. She shifted the duffel on her shoulder with practiced ease and began walking toward the command center. Her boots crunched on the packed snow with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The rhythm of someone who'd marched through worse terrain under worse conditions. Hayes and Reeves stood frozen for a moment. Reeves' expression showed grudging surprise. Something had just happened that he hadn't expected. The dismissive certainty he'd felt 2 minutes ago had developed cracks. Hayes's face showed something else in precisely. Deepening annoyance. Wounded pride. The particular indignation of a man who'd just been corrected by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. He jogged to catch up, his ego driving his feet. "The colonel runs this outpost, Cortez," he said sharply, coming alongside her. He doesn't appreciate know-it-alls from headquarters coming in and telling his people how to do their jobs." His voice carried an edge now. A warning. "You're here to fill a slot. Do your assigned tasks. Nothing more, remember that." Cortez said nothing. She simply walked on. Her silence was a far more effective rebuttal than any argument could have been. The soldiers they passed stopped their work to stare. A new face was rare at FOB Sentinel. A woman's face was rarer still. The looks followed a predictable pattern, curiosity melting into condescension. They saw a small woman in contractor fatigues, an outsider, a civilian, someone from the soft world of headquarters and climate-controlled offices, someone who didn't belong in their hard world of ice and steel. None of them saw the truth. None of them saw the quiet storm that had just made landfall on their frozen mountain. The command center squatted in the heart of FOB Sentinel like a concrete bunker from another era, which is exactly what it was. Built during the Cold War, reinforced during the Gulf War, updated with modern electronics, but still fundamentally the same structure that had been designed to survive a Soviet first strike. Inside, banks of monitors cast blue-white light across grim faces. The air smelled of recycled oxygen, burnt coffee, and the particular electrical ozone of overworked electronics. Tactical displays showed topographical maps of the surrounding mountains. Weather data scrolled endlessly. Satellite feeds flickered. At the center of it all stood Colonel Blake Morrison, 52 years old, square-jawed, barrel-chested, the kind of man who filled a room just by standing in it. His authority on this outpost was absolute, an extension of his own formidable ego and the silver eagles on his collar. He looked up as the tent flap opened. His eyes narrowed as Hayes and Reeves entered with Cortez in tow. "Colonel," Hayes announced with military crispness, "the liaison from Strategic Command." Morrison's gaze raked over her, a slow, dismissive appraisal from head to toe. He saw the unremarkable contractor fatigues, the absence of rank insignia, The slender frame that looked even smaller in the bulky cold weather gear. He saw exactly what he expected to see, what he wanted to see. A civilian, a bureaucrat, a box ticker sent from the rear echelon to bother him with paperwork and pointless inspections. His lip curled into a faint sneer. Cortez, he said. His voice was a low rumble that commanded attention by sheer force. I was told to expect a liaison. Nobody mentioned they were sending someone, so... He paused, let the silence stretch just long enough to be insulting. Young. The other officers in the tent chuckled softly, a sycophantic chorus for their commander. Cortez's expression remained unchanged. She met his gaze directly. Her pale eyes were as unyielding as the mountains outside. What's your function here? Morrison continued, leaning back against the central display table, making himself comfortable, making her wait. Data collation efficiency reports, morale surveys. More chuckles from the peanut gallery. My function is to observe and report on operational readiness, Colonel, Cortez replied. Her voice was level, professional, neither defensive nor aggressive. Is that so? Morrison leaned forward, placing his thick hands flat on the tactical display. The gesture was pure intimidation, calculated, rehearsed. Well, let me tell you what operational readiness looks like at 11,000 feet far from your comfortable desk in Colorado Springs. He gestured broadly at the displays around them. It's my men freezing their asses off on patrol in 40 below temperatures. It's Sergeant Reeves' engineers keeping our reactors from melting down when the backup generators fail. It's maintaining a defensive perimeter with equipment that's held together with duct tape and prayers. He straightened up. It's not reports, it's not theories. It's dirt and blood and cold. He turned away from her slightly, dismissing her without actually dismissing her. You want to observe? He gestured to a stack of data slates piled haphazardly in the corner. Start by observing our quarterly supply manifests. We're short on everything from power converters to protein paste. You can file a report on that. He glanced back at her, his eyes hard. It'll give you something useful to do while the adults handle the actual operations. It was a blatant, calculated insult, a clear relegation to the absolute lowest possible status. He was telling her and everyone else in the room that she was irrelevant, unwanted, beneath notice. Hayes smirked openly. Reeves had the decency to look down at his boots. A flicker of something, perhaps shame, perhaps just discomfort, crossed his weathered face. Understood, Colonel, Cortez said. Her voice betrayed nothing. No anger, no hurt, no emotion whatsoever. Good. Morrison turned his back on her fully, a final act of dismissal. Hayes show her to a spare bunk in the tech barracks. Then get her started on that inventory. Supply Unit 7. He paused, then added with casual cruelty, It's not heated. Dress warm. As Hayes led her toward the exit, Morrison returned his attention to the tactical displays. Already forgetting about her, already moving on to matters he deemed important. He didn't notice the man sitting quietly in the far corner of the command center. But Cortez did. Colonel James Brennan, retired, 72 years old. He sat in a metal folding chair, one hand resting on the walking cane propped beside him. His face was deeply lined, the kind of weathering that came from decades of harsh climates and harsher decisions. He wore a faded field jacket with unit patches from a different era. Gulf War, Desert Storm, the generation that had won America's last clear victory. His eyes, sharp blue, still clear despite his age, watched Cortez as she walked past. And in that brief moment, those eyes widened slightly. Recognition. Cortez's head turned fractionally. Her pale gray eyes met his blue ones. A connection passed between them, unspoken, invisible to everyone else in the room. She gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, less than an inch of movement. Brennan returned it, equally subtle. Then she was gone, following Hayes out into the frozen afternoon. Brennan sat very still. His weathered hands gripped the head of his cane a little tighter. His jaw worked silently as if he were having an internal conversation with himself. Reeves noticed. He'd been watching the old colonel and he'd seen the exchange. Sir, Reeves said, quietly approaching Brennan's corner. You know her. Brennan was silent for a long moment. His eyes remained fixed on the tent flap where she'd disappeared. I knew her, he finally said. His voice was gravelly, thoughtful. Long time ago. Who is she? Brennan looked up at Reeves. His expression was unreadable. Someone who's going to teach all of you a lesson you won't forget, Sergeant. He paused. The only question is whether you'll survive it. Supply Unit 7 was a metal shipping container, 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, filled floor to ceiling with racks of spare components and equipment. The kind of supply depot that existed on every military base in the world, neglected, disorganized, and colder than a mortician's handshake. Hayes slid the heavy door open with a metallic screech. Start with these. He gestured to a crate of fiber optic relays. Count them, tag them, log them in the inventory system. He paused, then added with barely concealed satisfaction. Try not to screw it up. The interior was dark. The single emergency light strip cast long, distorted shadows across boxes and equipment racks. The temperature inside was perhaps 5 degrees warmer than outside, which meant it was still well below freezing. Hayes left her there, slid the door almost completely shut, leaving only a 6-inch gap for ventilation. The message was clear: you're not important enough to waste heat on. Cortez stood in the near darkness for a long moment. She pulled a pair of thin, insulated gloves from her pocket, slipped them on with practiced efficiency. Then she reached into her jacket and withdrew a small LED headlamp. But she didn't turn it on. Instead, she let her eyes adjust, let her other senses take in the environment: the scent of ozone from dormant circuitry, the faint metallic tang of ionized components, the subtle difference in air pressure that indicated a poorly sealed container. All information, all useful. She began her work, but she didn't just count the relays. She inspected each one, running a gloved thumb over the connectors, checking for microscopic stress fractures in the casings. She sorted them not just by model number, but by manufacturing batch, arranging them in a way that was far more logical than the chaos she'd found. And as she worked, she cataloged everything. 6 MD7 encryption modules missing, high-value items, not the kind of thing that disappeared accidentally, 3 frequency scanners gone, Cold War-era equipment, supposedly decommissioned but still valuable on certain black markets. A pattern emerged. Someone with technical knowledge had been selectively stealing components, not randomly, deliberately. Components that would be useful to someone planning to intercept or decrypt military communications using older protocols. She made mental notes, took photos with a device she pulled from an inner pocket, said nothing. An hour passed. The door scraped open. Sergeant Reeves stood in the gap holding 2 steaming mugs. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Brought you some coffee, he said, not quite an apology, but not hostile either. Synthetic blend, tastes like motor oil, but it's hot. Thank you, Sergeant. She took the mug. Her fingers barely seemed to register the heat through her gloves. She didn't drink, just held it, letting the warmth exist. Reeves lingered, shifted his weight, the behavior of a man who wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Look, he finally said, his voice dropping. The colonel, he's under a lot of pressure. This posting is a meat grinder, equipment failures, supply shortages, zero support from regional command. He paused. He doesn't have much patience for outsiders. Everyone is an outsider until they're not, Cortez replied. Her attention remained on a box of cooling fans she was organizing. Yeah, well, Reeves cleared his throat. Word of advice, keep your head down. Do the jobs he assigns. He respects soldiers who know their place. He hesitated, then added, that talk about the communications dish, that kind of thing, it doesn't help you here. He was trying to be kind, in his own gruff way, trying to help her navigate Morrison's kingdom, offering her the key to survival, submission. Cortez paused. She looked at him, her gray eyes seeming to see right through his weathered exterior, through the Gulf War ribbons he still wore with pride, through the protective cynicism he'd built him up over 27 years of service. The truth doesn't require help, Sergeant, she said quietly. It just is. She turned back to her work. The conversation was over. Reeves stood there for another moment. The steam from his own mug swirled in the frozen air like dissipating ghosts. He'd come here to offer advice, to warn a naive civilian about how things worked on Morrison's Mountain. But as he watched her work in the freezing dark, her movements precise and economical, her focus absolute, he felt something strange. Unease. Not threat, not quite. just the distinct feeling that he'd made an incorrect assessment. That the woman sorting equipment in this frozen box was something other than what she appeared to be. That perhaps he was the one who should be listening. He shook his head, dismissed the feeling as a trick of the altitude and the cold, took a long drink of his terrible coffee. Then he walked away, leaving her alone in the dark and the cold and the quiet. Midnight arrived on FOB Sentinel with brutal clarity, the kind of cold that made sound travel differently, that made stars look close enough to touch, that turned exhaled breath into instant ice crystals. Cortez couldn't sleep, not unusual. Combat veterans rarely slept well. The body remembered too many nights when sleep meant death, when the ability to wake instantly at the first wrong sound was the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the dark. She walked the perimeter, just another insomniac doing laps. Nobody questioned it. Half the base was awake at any given hour, trying to burn off nervous energy or escape nightmares. But her walk wasn't random. She observed the guard rotations, noted the 17-minute gap when Tower 3's sightline to the fuel depot was blocked by a supply truck that shouldn't have been parked there, counted the seconds between automated sensor sweeps, identified 4 blind spots in the defensive coverage that a competent infiltration team could exploit. She saw the base as it truly was, not the fortress Morrison believed he commanded, but a collection of vulnerabilities held together by routine and the enemy's current lack of interest. And then she saw the old man. Colonel Brennan sat on a bench near the western perimeter wall. His cane leaned beside him. His breath formed small clouds in the Arctic air. He didn't turn as she approached, but his posture shifted slightly. Acknowledgement. Couldn't sleep either. His voice was rough, like gravel being poured from a bucket. Old habit, sir. Jim, he corrected. We're the same rank now, Rachel. Have been for a while. She sat beside him, left a respectful distance. 2 soldiers sharing a moment. Nothing more. You look good, he said, still not looking at her, both of them staring out at the dark mountains. Star suits you. Thank you. How long's it been since Iraq? 16 years for both of us. He chuckled. A dry sound. Math checks out. I was the old man even then. You were just a kid. 18, 19, 18, second lieutenant, fresh out of OCS, convinced I knew everything. You knew more than most, Brennan said. You listened. That's rare. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from shared history, from mutual respect earned in hard places. Morrison doesn't know, does he? Brennan finally asked. No. Hayes, no. Anyone, just you. Brennan nodded slowly. How long you planning to keep it quiet? As long as it takes, in the eyes. To do what? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. Almost. 3 years ago, a base like this one failed. Command breakdown, poor discipline, systems neglected. She paused. I lost 23 soldiers, including my best team leader. Brennan's jaw tightened. I remember reading about that. Task Force Reaper, Syria. Morrison wasn't there, but he's exactly like the commander who was. Arrogant, dismissive, more concerned with his authority than his readiness. So Stratcom sent you to audit him. Stratcom gave me the mission. I volunteered for it. Why, Paye? Because I need to know if we learned anything. If commanders like Morrison can be saved, or if they're too far gone. She turned to look at him for the first time. And because you're here, if you're still here, there's a reason. Brennan's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile, might have been something sadder. I'm here because I'm too old to be useful anywhere else, and too stubborn to retire completely. He tapped his cane. Took shrapnel from a Scud missile in '91. Hip never healed right. These days, I'm just the old man who tells war stories nobody wants to hear. Morrison listens to you. Morrison tolerates me. Barely. I make him uncomfortable. I represent a generation he doesn't understand. Wars he didn't fight. Values he thinks are outdated. Brennan shook his head. He respects rank, but he doesn't respect wisdom. Can he be taught? That's what you're here to find out, isn't it? She didn't answer. Didn't need to. They watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. The same stars that had watched over Kuwait, over Iraq, over every frozen outpost where soldiers had stood guard against enemies, both seen and unseen. The Type 9 transmitter, Cortez said quietly. The archive manifest said it was decommissioned. But I know you. You wouldn't let them destroy it. Brennan's expression didn't change, but his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Equipment manifest paperwork is so complicated these days. Easy for things to get misplaced, misfiled. Where is it? Command center. Far corner. Under a tarp. Everyone thinks it's scrap waiting for disposal. Does it work? Tested it 6 months ago. Still purrs like it's 1985. He paused. You think you'll need it? I think when satellites fail, you need what works. An analog always works. That's what I taught you. That's why I listened. Brennan turned to look at her fully now. In the starlight, his face was all deep lines and hard shadows. The face of a man who'd seen the worst humanity could offer and somehow remained human anyway. How old are you now, Rachel? 34. Christ, 34. Youngest brigadier general in modern history. You know what I was at 34? What? A lieutenant. Still figuring out how to lead a platoon in the desert without getting everyone killed. He shook his head. You've accomplished more in 16 years than most do in 40. I had a good teacher. You had drive. I just pointed you in the right direction. She stood, prepared to continue her patrol, to maintain her cover as just another contractor wandering the base. Jim, she said, pausing, when this goes sideways, and it will, I need you to back me, no matter how it looks. You think Morrison's going to fail? I think Murphy's Law applies to everyone, and this base is overdue. Brennan stood as well, slower, using his cane to leverage himself up, the movements of a man whose body had been used hard and was sending the bill. I've backed you since you were 19 years old, Rachel. I'm not stopping now. He gripped her shoulder briefly, a gesture of affection, of pride. But be careful. Morrison's ego is fragile. Cornered dogs bite. I know. That's what I'm counting on. She walked away, her boots crunching softly on the packed snow. Brennan watched her go, a small figure disappearing into the darkness. A woman who carried more authority than anyone on this base suspected, who held the power to end careers or save lives with a single word, and who had chosen to come here anonymously, to be dismissed and insulted and relegated to the freezing dark, just to see what kind of men they really were. He looked up at the stars again, the same stars he'd navigated by during Desert Storm when GPS satellites were still experimental, the same stars that never lied, that never changed their positions, that could be trusted when nothing else could. Or it helped them, he whispered to the night. They have no idea what's coming. Morning came with brutal efficiency. 0600, the sun, a pale disk behind sheets of wind-driven snow. Morrison's morning briefing was a well-rehearsed performance. He stood at the central display using a laser pointer to highlight patrol routes and sensor coverage. His officers clustered around, nodding at appropriate moments, taking notes they'd never review. As you can see, Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never been truly tested. Our defensive coverage is comprehensive. Drone patrols provide real-time surveillance of every approach. Automated turrets give us 360 coverage. Seismic sensors detect any movement larger than a deer within 5 clicks. He gestured broadly at the displays. Triple redundancy on all critical systems. We're as close to impenetrable as current technology allows. From his corner, Brennan spoke quietly. What's your backup if the drones fail, Colonel? Morrison barely glanced at him. They won't. The systems are hardened against EMP, shielded against interference. They're designed to function in worst-case scenarios. Still good to have a backup, Brennan said mildly. During the Iraq War, we learned that any system can fail, usually at the worst possible moment. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. With respect, Colonel Brennan, this isn't 1991. We have 21st century systems, proven technology, not jury-rigged radio sets and smoke signals. A few officers chuckled. Uncomfortable laughter. The kind that came from watching someone dismiss a man they respected but were afraid to defend. Brennan said nothing, just nodded slightly and returned to his coffee. Morrison continued his briefing. Hayes asked a question designed to make himself look intelligent. Reeves reported on minor maintenance issues. The routine ground on. Cortez stood against the back wall. She'd been invited to observe, or rather, she'd been told to attend so Morrison could demonstrate his superiority. Another opportunity to put the civilian contractor in her place. She took notes on a small tablet, observing everything, saying nothing. At one point, Specialist Sarah Blake, a young tech analyst with barely 2 years of service, checked her secondary monitor. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "no AA is reporting unusual solar activity. Class X flare potential within the next 24 hours. Morrison glanced at the report, dismissed it with a wave. "Our systems are shielded. Standard precaution but not a concern." He looked at Blake. "Update the log. Continue monitoring. Nothing more." "Yes, sir." Cortez and Brennan's eyes met across the room. A brief connection. They both knew what the others didn't. Solar flares didn't care about shielding specifications. Coronal mass ejections didn't respect engineering tolerances. Mother Nature had been destroying human technology for billions of years before humans existed and would continue long after they were gone. And FOB Sentinel's hardened systems were built by the lowest bidder. The briefing ended. Officers dispersed to their duties. Morrison left for his office, already thinking about lunch. Brennan approached Cortez as she was leaving. 24 hours, he said quietly. Maybe less. "You ready?" "Always." "Morrison's not." "I know." She walked out into the brightening day. The snow had stopped temporarily. Visibility extended perhaps half a mile before the mountains swallowed everything in white obscurity. She looked up at the sky, at the sun hidden behind high clouds, at the invisible threat racing toward them at millions of miles per hour. 1 billion tons of charged particles. An electromagnetic hammer about to strike an electronic world. And when it did, everything Morrison trusted would die. Everything Brennan had taught her would live. The old ways, the reliable ways. The ways that didn't need batteries or satellites or computer screens. She returned to Supply Unit 7, closed the door behind her, opened her duffel. Inside, carefully packed in foam and protective wrapping, was her insurance policy. A vacuum tube, custom-made, hand-wound tungsten filament, smoky quartz glass that had been shaped and annealed with techniques that predated transistors by decades. She'd made it herself. Spent 6 months learning glass blowing and metallurgy from an 80-year-old engineer who'd worked on the Manhattan Project, who remembered when vacuum tubes were cutting-edge technology, who understood that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked when everything else failed. Beside it, carefully wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, was a hand-cranked generator. Cold War vintage. Built to function in temperatures that would kill modern electronics. Simple mechanics, gears and magnets and copper wire. No circuit boards, no microchips, no vulnerabilities. Just physics, just engineering, just the fundamental principles that didn't change no matter how much technology advanced. She checked each piece of her kit, made sure everything was ready, made sure she could assemble it in the dark if necessary. Because it would be necessary. Murphy's Law was absolute. If something could fail, it would, at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way. But if you prepared for Murphy, if you respected his law and planned accordingly, then when he came calling, you'd be ready. She closed the duffel, sealed it, marked it with a piece of tape that looked random but indicated to her exactly where each component was positioned inside. Then she went back to counting inventory, playing her role, being the dismissed contractor that Morrison expected, while the sun prepared to teach them all a lesson about humility. The crisis arrived at 0847, not with warning klaxons or urgent announcements, not with time to prepare or protocols to follow. It arrived as silence, a wave of charged particles ejected from the sun's corona. 93 million miles away, traveling at 4 million miles per hour, slammed into Earth's magnetosphere with the force of 1 trillion hydrogen bombs. On the surface, the sky flickered. Auroras danced at noon, green and purple curtains of light rippling across the heavens in latitudes where they had no business appearing. Beautiful, terrifying, a visible manifestation of invisible destruction. At Forward Operating Base Sentinel, the world simply ended. Every screen in the command center flashed white simultaneously. Error messages cascaded across displays faster than human eyes could track. Text scrolled, warnings blared, systems reported catastrophic failures and electronic voices that cut off mid-word. Then darkness. The primary lights died. The low constant hum of electronics, that background noise so ever-present, you only noticed it when it stopped, ceased instantly. Replaced by a silence so profound it felt like physical pressure against the eardrums. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later. Red bulbs casting everything in a hellish pulsing glow, turning faces into skull-like masks, making the command center look like the interior of a dying ship. Colonel Morrison stood frozen at the central display table. The holographic projection had vanished mid-sentence, leaving him staring at a dead black surface. What the hell just happened? His voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge underneath. The first crack in his armor of certainty. Lieutenant Hayes frantically stabbed at his tablet. His fingers moved with increasing desperation across an unresponsive screen. I don't know, sir. Everything's down. Everything. Main power grid just failed. Backup generators. He looked up, his face pale in the red emergency lighting. Sir, the backup generators just failed too. We're on battery power and it's draining fast. Morrison's head snapped toward the communication station. Comms, get me regional command, now. Specialist Blake sat at her console, hands hovering uselessly over dead controls. She shook her head, her eyes wide. Dead, sir. All of it. Satellite uplink, HF radio, laser comms, even the hardline land link. Her voice rose slightly. It's all static, pure white noise. It's like someone just threw a blanket over the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The command center had handled crises before. Equipment failures, weather emergencies, supply shortages, but those were problems with solutions. Problems with protocols and backup plans and chain of command procedures. This was different. This was every system failing simultaneously. This was the carefully constructed technological bubble they lived in simply popping. This was isolation at 11,000 feet with no way to call for help. And isolation at this altitude, in these conditions, was a death sentence measured in hours. Morrison's breathing accelerated slightly. His eyes darted from station to station, looking for something, anything that still worked. A deeper alarm began to blare. Different frequency, more urgent. The seismic sensor console lit up with angry red indicators. Master Sergeant Williams, 55 years old, weathered face like cracked leather, stared at his screen. The seismic monitoring system ran on its own independent power source, a precaution from the Cold War days when they designed redundancy into everything. It was one of the few systems still partially functional. Sir, Williams' voice was strained. Careful. The tone of a man delivering news he knew would be catastrophic. You need to see this. Morrison crossed to the seismic station in 3 strides, looked over Williams' shoulder at the topographical display. A series of red icons moved steadily through the mountain passes, through terrain that intelligence had classified as impassable for heavy armor, through routes that Morrison's defensive planning had written off as naturally secure. 12 icons, moving fast, moving with purpose. That's impossible, Morrison breathed. His face had gone from pale to gray. There's no way. Our drone patrols cover that sector every 2 hours. We would have seen them staging. We would have had warning. Drones are down, sir, Hayes said. His voice cracked slightly. Whatever that electromagnetic pulse was, it fried them. All of them. Williams ran a quick diagnostic, his fingers steady despite the crisis. Years of training taking over. When panic threatened, you fell back on procedure. Analyzing the seismic signature now, sir. He studied the data streaming across his monitor. Mass estimates, vibration patterns, ground pressure calculations. Heavy armor, T-95 Golem-class main battle tanks. He paused, double-checking numbers that couldn't possibly be right. At least 12 units. Looks like a full armored spearhead. Now, the implication landed like a physical blow. The enemy had used the solar flare, an event they must have anticipated, must have planned for, to launch a surprise attack through supposedly secure terrain. While FOB Sentinel's expensive, sophisticated 21st century surveillance network was reduced to expensive scrap metal, and FOB Sentinel was the only thing standing between that armored column and the undefended valleys beyond the mountain range. Valleys with supply depots and communications hubs and civilian contractors who had no idea death was rolling toward them at 30 miles per hour. Fear began to spread through the command staff like poison through water. Their multi-billion-dollar defense network had been rendered useless by a solar tantrum. They were blind, deaf, and mute, facing an enemy who had picked the perfect moment to strike. Panic, cold and sharp, threaded its way through trained soldiers who'd never actually been tested. "Get me a runner." Morrison's voice rose for the first time, the controlled command presence slipping. "Send a message to the outer perimeter. Full alert. I want every heavy weapon manned and ready." "Sir," Hayes tried to interject. "Do it." Hayes flinched. "Sir, they won't have targeting data. The automated turrets are slave to the main network. Without the computer controls, they're just expensive sculptures." "Then we use iron sights." Sergeant Reeves had entered the command center, drawn by the commotion, his Gulf War training kicking in. "My engineers can still fight, sir. We put eyes on targets and we pull triggers. Like soldiers did for 10,000 years before computers." "Fight what, Sergeant?" Morrison rounded on him, his composure fracturing completely now. "A dozen Golem-class tanks with nothing but rifles and a few shoulder-launched missiles. They'll roll over us in 20 minutes flat." He slammed his fist on the dead communications console. The sound echoed in the tense silence. "We need air support. We need orbital strikes. We need intelligence on their approach vectors." His voice was rising to a shout. "We need to get a goddamn message out." His officers stared at him. Their commander, their rock, the man who'd always had the answer, and watched him come apart. The carefully constructed hierarchy of Phobos Sentinel was crumbling. Not from enemy action, from the simple reality that Morrison had never actually led men in combat, had never faced a crisis where the rulebook didn't apply, had never learned to think without computers telling him what to think. The air grew thick with the metallic taste of failure. Into this maelstrom of rising panic, a figure stepped through the tent flap, Cortez. She was no longer wearing the bulky cold-weather parka, just simple combat fatigues. In her hands, she carried a canvas tool roll and a weathered duffel bag. The red emergency lights cast strange shadows on her severe face, made her pale eyes seem to glow with cold internal light. She walked past the frantic officers with calm, deliberate steps. Her boots made soft sounds on the composite floor. Nobody paid her any attention. They were too consumed by their own crisis, too focused on the impossible situation bearing down on them. She was just the contractor, the inventory clerk, completely irrelevant to the life and death situation at hand. She stopped in the far corner of the command center, in front of a piece of equipment covered by a dusty tarp. It had sat there so long most of the younger soldiers had forgotten it existed. Just another piece of surplus junk waiting to be hauled away, taking up valuable space. Cortez gripped the edge of the tarp with both hands and pulled. The tarp came away in a single smooth motion. Dust filled the air, swirling in the red emergency lighting like smoke. Beneath it sat a piece of history. The Type 9 analog burst transmitter. It was a hulking metal box, 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, covered in heavy dial controls and copper heat sinks gone green with age. Vacuum tube sockets visible through maintenance panels. A large manual crank generator bolted to one side. Thick power cables coiled like sleeping snakes. An anachronism, a relic. Technology from when Reagan was president and the Soviet Union still existed. Technology that hadn't been used in active operations in over 30 years. Morrison finally noticed her. His mounting fear and frustration erupted into pure rage. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He strode toward her, his face flushed red even in the crimson lighting. "Get away from that equipment. This is not the time to be playing with museum pieces." Cortez didn't even look at him. She unrolled her canvas toolkit on a nearby crate with practiced precision. Inside, a set of perfectly maintained vintage tools. Vacuum tube pullers with wooden handles worn smooth by use. Spools of silver solder. A delicate voltmeter with an analog needle. Wire strippers. Precision screwdrivers. Tools that belonged in a museum alongside the transmitter. Tools that worked. Her focus was absolute. She opened a maintenance panel on the side of the transmitter, revealing a complex web of wiring and glowing glass tubes. "That thing is a paperweight, Cortez," Hayes chimed in, his voice dripping with scorn and desperate fear. The power grid is down. The amplification systems are probably cracked from disuse. It's useless. Cortez's hand went to her duffel bag. She unzipped a side pocket with careful deliberation, withdrew a small lead-lined box. She opened it. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a single large vacuum tube. The glass was pristine, smoky quartz. The filament inside was a complex lattice of hand-wound tungsten wire. It looked nothing like the standard issue tubes visible in the transmitter. This was something else entirely, something custom, something cared for. She reached into the transmitter with a tube puller, extracted one of the central amplifier tubes, clearly burned out, its glass blackened with surgical precision. With the reverence of a surgeon transplanting a heart, she slotted her custom tube into the empty socket, the pins seated with a soft, satisfying click. "I am ordering you to stop this nonsense and get out of my command center," Morrison shouted. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to physically remove her. Sergeant Reeves put a hand on Morrison's arm, firm, respectful, but stopping him. "Sir." Reeves's voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. "Just for a second. Let's see." Morrison turned on him, furious. "Sergeant, I gave you an order to—" "Sir, please." Reeves didn't back down. "Just watch." Something in Reeves' tone cut through Morrison's panic. Perhaps it was the steadiness. Perhaps it was the fact that Reeves, who'd actually seen combat, who'd actually faced death, wasn't panicking. Morrison jerked his arm free but took a step back. From his corner, Colonel Brennan rose to his feet, slowly, using his cane for support. But when he stood at full attention. Every eye in the room noticed. The old colonel never stood unless there was a damn good reason. Brennan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Everyone, shut up and watch a master work." The authority in those words, the absolute command, froze everyone in place. Cortez ignored them all. She connected a pair of heavy cables from the hand-crank generator directly to the transmitter's main power bus, bypassing the base's fried power converters entirely. Her movements were economical, professional, the work of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Then she gripped the crank handle and began to turn. At first, the mechanism was stiff, decades of disuse fighting against her, but then the gears engaged with a series of metallic clicks. The resistance smoothed out, became rhythmic. A low hum started to emanate from the machine, a sound no one on this base had ever heard before, a sound from another era. The filaments in the vacuum tubes began to glow. First a dull red, then warming to vibrant orange, the same warm amber light that had illuminated bomber cockpits during Desert Storm, that had powered communications during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that had sent coordinates for artillery strikes against Iraqi positions in Kuwait. The hum deepened, rose in pitch as she cranked faster. Her movement was smooth and powerful, belying her slender frame. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on her brow, but her rhythm never faltered. 60 cranks per minute, like a heartbeat, steady, reliable, eternal. She placed a pair of antique-looking headphones over her ears, heavy brown Bakelite with cracked leather padding. One cup pushed back so she could still hear the room, still maintain awareness. Her left hand continued to turn the crank at that steady, precise speed, feeding the machine its lifeblood. Mechanical energy converted to electrical. No batteries required, no infrastructure needed, just human muscle and simple physics. Her right hand hovered over a large brass telegraph key mounted to the transmitter's face. Brennan stepped closer, not interfering, just positioning himself where he could see, where he could translate for the others. "She's not trying to reach regional command," he said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been awe, might have been pride. "Look at the frequency calibration." The younger officers looked at dials and numbers that meant nothing to them. Brennan continued, "That's a military band from 1985, requires immense power and perfect understanding of atmospheric bounce to use. Nobody's monitored those frequencies in 30 years. "Then what's the point?" Hayes asked. His voice had lost its contempt. Now it was just confused, desperate for understanding. "She's not sending a message," Brennan said. "She's sending a command." Cortez's fingers began to move across the brass key. The clicks and clacks created a sharp staccato rhythm that cut through the tense silence. Morse code. Not the simple SOS that Boy Scouts learned. This was complex, multi-layered, a stream of data compressed into dots and dashes. Brennan listened, his expression changed, eyes widening, mouth opening slightly. "That's a Cerberus cipher," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, she has the keys." "What keys?" Reeves asked. "Authentication codes, one-time pad encryption, the kind of security we used for nuclear launch authorization during the Cold War." Brennan's voice was barely audible now. "You need presidential-level clearance just to know those codes exist." Her fingers flew across the key with practiced speed, each click precise, each pause exact. She was speaking a language of pure authority, a stream of commands that were not requests, not suggestions, orders. She was speaking to something very old, very powerful, and very far away. Morrison stood frozen. The sheer focused intensity of her actions held him mesmerized. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur. This was virtuoso performance. A master musician playing an instrument no one else remembered existed. The entire command staff stood transfixed, their own crisis momentarily forgotten as they witnessed this impossible act of technical necromancy, this resurrection of the dead. Specialist Blake was the first to see the response. Her station, a redundant monitoring system tied into the orbital early warning network, had been as dead as everything else. But now a single line of green text flickered to life on the dark screen. Just one line, glowing against the black. A system handshake, a digital acknowledgement of received transmission. "Sir." Blake's voice trembled with something between awe and terror. I have a signal." Morrison tore his eyes away from Cortez, rushed to Blake's console, stared at the screen like a man seeing a miracle. A new window was opening, text scrolling, but it wasn't from regional command. It wasn't from any terrestrial source. The insignia that flashed in the corner of the screen was one Morrison had only ever seen in top-secret briefings, in classified documents that he'd needed special authorization just to read. The three-headed dog of Cerberus, the Aegis Orbital Defense Initiative, a weapons platform conceived during the Cold War, built during the Reagan administration, designed to stop Soviet tank divisions from rolling through the Fulda Gap, a constellation of kinetic orbital strike satellites that represented the ultimate high ground. Dormant for 30 years, waiting, silent, forgotten by everyone except a very few. A live satellite feed filled Blake's screen, crystal clear thermal imaging from 200 miles above the Earth, a top-down infrared view of the Gorgon's Pass. The enemy armored column was clearly visible, 12 white-hot signatures moving inexorably toward FOB Sentinel's position. Heat blooms against the cold mountain terrain, death on treads. Text began to scroll rapidly down the side of the screen. Aegis Orbital Defense Initiative, Reagan Legacy Platform, active system status, nominal receiving Cerberus key transmission source FOB Sentinel Montana authenticating. The system paused, processing, analyzing the authentication codes being transmitted by that antique brass telegraph key. Code authentication, valid transmission protocol Cerberus Omega operator. Skill level expert analyzing operator identity. Another pause, longer this time, as if the ancient satellite system was accessing databases that predated the internet, cross-referencing codes against authorization lists maintained in Cold War-era formats. Brennan stood rigid, his hand gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He knew what was coming, had known from the moment she'd started transmitting. But knowing and seeing were two different things. The final line appeared, stark and undeniable in glowing green text. Authorizing user Cortez, Rachel Marie rank, Brigadier General 07 position, Commander Special Operations Task Force, Reaper age 34 years distinction, youngest female general in U.S. Military history clearance, top secret special compartmented information service record, Iraq, 3 deployments, Afghanistan, 4 deployments, Syria, 2 deployments commendations, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor, Silver Star, 1 Distinguished Service Cross, 1 confirmed kills classified. Status authenticated awaiting fire mission. The air was sucked out of the command center. Every person in the room stopped breathing simultaneously. A collective sharp intake followed by absolute silence. Morrison stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process the words. reading them again and again, each time hoping they'd say something different. General, Brigadier General, Cortez Rachel Marie, General. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, like a robot running a damaged program, turned to look at the woman in the corner, the woman he'd insulted, the woman he'd dismissed as a child playing dress-up, the woman he'd called Miss Cortez with barely concealed contempt, the woman he'd ordered to count spare parts in a freezing storage container, the woman who was still cranking the generator with steady rhythm, sweat beading on her temples, face set in grim concentration, completely focused on her mission. A general, youngest female general in United States history. Lieutenant Hayes's jaw had fallen open, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to track. Shock, disbelief, horror, the dawning realization of every dismissive word he'd spoken, every condescending smirk, every casual insult. He looked like a man watching his career evaporate in real time. Sergeant Reeves snapped to rigid attention, his body executing the movement before his conscious mind even processed the command. 27 years of training taking over. When you saw a general's rank, you stood at attention, no exceptions. His eyes were wide, but unlike the others, his expression showed something else beneath the shock. Recognition, understanding. 1,000 small moments from the past 2 days suddenly clicking into place like puzzle pieces finding their homes. Her unnerving calm, her precise assessment of the communications dish, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the absolute certainty in everything she did. It wasn't arrogance, it was authority. Authority so absolute, she'd had no need to display it. The younger soldiers looked confused. They didn't understand what this meant, didn't grasp the full implications. But the older NCOs, the men in their 40s and 50s, who'd served when rank actually meant something, they understood instantly. Master Sergeant Williams came to attention. The communications specialist, a 43-year-old staff sergeant, followed suit. A wave of salutes rippling through the room as understanding spread. Colonel Morrison felt a wave of cold dread wash over him, colder than any mountain wind, more penetrating than the altitude's bitter chill. The liaison mission wasn't a routine inspection. It was a personal audit of his command by one of the highest-ranking special operations officers in the entire military. An audit conducted anonymously, designed to reveal the truth beneath the official reports and polished briefings. And he had just failed that audit in every conceivable way. He had not only shown his base to be unprepared, not only demonstrated critical vulnerabilities in his defensive posture, he had shown himself to be a petty, arrogant fool who judged warriors by their appearance rather than their substance, who valued his ego over his mission, who crumbled under pressure. He had dismissed expertise because it came in a package he didn't expect, had relegated competence to a freezing storage unit because it threatened his authority. And now that competence was the only thing standing between his command and complete annihilation. General Cortez remained oblivious to the revelations sweeping through the room, or perhaps indifferent to it. Her left hand continued its steady cranking. Her right hand flew across the telegraph key. The last series of clicks was different. Brennan recognized it immediately. Coordinates, targeting data, a fire mission transmitted with absolute precision. She finished the transmission, the final click echoing in the silent room. Then she slowly released the crank. The humming of the ancient machine gradually died down, leaving an even more profound silence in its wake. She pulled the headphones off with careful deliberation, set them gently on the transmitter's surface, treating the equipment with the respect it deserved. Then she turned. Her pale gray eyes swept over the stunned faces of the command staff, over Morrison's ashen features, over Hayes's barely controlled panic, over Reeves's rigid attention, over Brennan's proud smile. She looked at Morrison directly, and for the first time since arriving at Phobos Sentinel, emotion showed on her face. Not anger, not triumph, not vindication. Disappointment, deep, weary disappointment. The look of a teacher whose student had failed to learn the simplest lesson. On Blake's screen, new text appeared. Targeting solution received in lock, coordinates confirmed, 47 DG 1433 and 112 DG 4107. Target classification, unarmored column 12 units. Threat assessment, critical deploying kinetic payloads. Time to impact, 15 seconds. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye fixed on the screen. On the thermal imaging showing 12 white-hot tanks rolling through the mountain pass, oblivious to the judgment falling from heaven. 15 seconds stretched into eternity. The enemy column continued its advance. Commanders in those tanks probably congratulating themselves on their brilliant timing, on catching the Americans blind and helpless, on the easy victory rolling toward them. 14 seconds. Morrison's breath came in short gasps. His world had collapsed. His certainty shattered. Everything he thought he knew revealed as illusion. 13 seconds. Hayes gripped the edge of a console to keep from falling. His legs had gone weak. 12 seconds. Reeves held his salute. Steady, waiting, a soldier honoring a general who'd earned her stars and blood. 11 seconds. Brennan watched Cortez with undisguised pride. This was his student, his protege. The young lieutenant he'd trained 16 years ago in the deserts. Now a general, still listening, still learning, still applying the fundamental truths. 10 seconds. In orbit, ancient mechanisms stirred to life. Targeting computers from the 1980s, simple, robust, reliable calculated trajectories with cold precision. 9 seconds, 8 seconds. Cortez stood perfectly still. No tension in her posture, no anxiety, just the calm that came from knowing you'd done everything correctly, that you'd prepared, that you were ready when Murphy's Law came calling. 7 seconds, 6 seconds, 5 seconds. The tanks rolled on. No warning systems, no indication of threat, just the confident advance of an army that thought it had won. 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. The top of Blake's screen flared with impossibly bright, silent flashes, like stars being born and dying in microseconds. 2 seconds later, the ground beneath Phobos Sentinel trembled. A deep, resonant shudder that vibrated up through the soles of boots, through the foundation, through the mountain itself. On the screen, the enemy column vanished, not in explosions of fire and smoke, not with dramatic mushroom clouds or cinematic destruction. They simply ceased to exist. Massive dark craters appeared where the golem tanks had been moments before. The kinetic rods, simple tungsten spears, 6 meters long, traveling at hypersonic speeds, had struck with the force of tactical nuclear weapons, but with no radiation, no fallout, no electromagnetic pulse, just mass times velocity. Einstein's equation made manifest. The conversion of potential energy into pure, brutal, total destruction. Clean, efficient, absolute. The seismic sensor console, which had been screaming with the vibration signatures of 12 heavy tanks, went flat. The red icons blinked out of existence as if they'd never been. The threat was neutralized. From the moment Cortez had gripped the generator crank to the final impact, less than 5 minutes had elapsed. 5 minutes to save an entire base. 5 minutes to eliminate a threat that Morrison's 21st century systems couldn't even detect, let alone stop. 5 minutes using technology from 1985. Cortez walked to the tactical display, her movements calm, unhurried. She ran a finger across Blake's screen, bringing up the post-strike analysis. Damage assessment data scrolled past. Satellite confirmation. Thermal imaging of the impact sites. Strike assessment complete, targets eliminated. 12-12. Collateral damage, 0 civilians, affected 0. Mission status is success. Perfect strike. Textbook execution. 0 mistakes. She straightened, turned to face the room. The silence was absolute, thick with awe and shame and the particular weight that came from witnessing something that would mark you forever. Colonel Blake Morrison, a man who had not bowed to anyone in 20 years, who had built his identity on being the hardest man in any room, felt his knees tremble. He looked at the woman before him. Not the contractor, not the civilian, not the child, the general, the youngest general in American military history, who held the power of orbital fire in her fingertips, who had just single-handedly saved his entire command using a machine his generation had forgotten existed. He saw the sweat on her brow from the physical exertion, the wet sheen from cranking a generator for 5 minutes straight while maintaining perfect rhythm and simultaneously transmitting complex encrypted commands in Morse code. She had worked, had strained, had pushed herself physically to save them, while he had stood paralyzed, useless, broken. The weight of his failure crashed down upon him like a physical thing, like the mountain itself collapsing on his shoulders. His training took over. The core of what he'd been taught before ego had corrupted it, before comfort had made him soft, before he'd forgotten what service actually meant. His back snapped ramrod straight. His arms shot up in the crispest, most rigid salute of his entire life. Every muscle locked, every movement precise. General, the word came out thick, choked with emotion he couldn't name. Humility, shame, gratitude, terror, all of it mixed into a single syllable. The word hung in the air, a final stunning confirmation to anyone who'd still harbored doubt. Lieutenant Hayes followed immediately, his own salute shaky, imperfect, his face ashen with the knowledge of his own destruction. One by one, every person in the command center came to attention, arms raising in a unified gesture of ultimate respect. Master Sergeant Williams, Specialist Blake, the communications operators, the junior analysts, even the civilians present, contractors and technicians who weren't required to salute, stood straight, honoring something they didn't fully understand but recognized as greater than themselves. They stood there, a silent formation, saluting the woman they had dismissed, the woman who had saved them all. Cortez did not immediately return the salute. She let the moment stretch, her pale gray eyes moving from face to face, not savoring their submission, not enjoying their discomfort, teaching them, forcing them to confront the chasm between their assumptions and reality, making them really understand that true strength had nothing to do with rank insignia displayed on collars, nothing to do with gender or age or the volume of your voice. It was about competence under fire, about preparation meeting opportunity, about seeing the one solution when everyone else saw only the problem, about respecting the fundamentals that didn't change, the physics that didn't care about your ego, the simple truth that tools which don't need batteries will outlast tools that do. 5 seconds passed, an eternity for men standing at attention. Finally, she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. Not quite a return salute, an acknowledgement, an acceptance of the new reality. The message was clear. The old way of doing things at FOB Sentinel was over. She turned away from them, walked back to the Type 9 transmitter, began methodically disconnecting the leads from the hand-crank generator, her movements just as precise and unhurried as before. The crisis was over, but for the men frozen at attention in that command center, the reckoning had just begun. The hours that followed moved with strange elasticity, time stretched and compressed, moments of clarity punctuated by long stretches where men moved through their duties like sleepwalkers processing a nightmare. The solar flare ebbed, its electromagnetic fury subsiding as the wave of charged particles passed beyond Earth's magnetosphere. Like a storm moving out to sea, leaving wreckage in its wake. FOB Sentinel's systems began the slow, painstaking process of coming back online. Engineers worked with a new and terrified sense of purpose. Every connection checked, every circuit tested, every backup system verified because they'd learned in the hardest possible way that assumptions killed. The story of what had happened in the command center spread through the outpost like wildfire, whispered in hushed, awestruck tones in the barracks, repeated with embellishment in the mess hall, discussed in careful, measured words by NCOs who understood the implications. The new contractor wasn't a contractor. The quiet woman they'd mocked was Brigadier General Rachel Cortez, the youngest female general in United States history, commander of Task Force Reaper, the unit that had hunted high-value targets across 3 war zones for a decade. The woman who in less than 5 minutes had called down fire from heaven and erased an enemy armored column from existence. The casual mockery and dismissive jokes of 2 days ago had curdled into something else entirely. A thick, pervasive silence of profound respect mixed with fear. The fear that came from knowing you'd stood in the presence of true competence and failed to recognize it. That you'd insulted someone who could end careers with a single word. That you'd been weighed, measured, and found catastrophically wanting. Cortez was not in the command center overseeing the recovery. Morrison had offered her his office, his quarters, anything she required. She declined with polite brevity and disappeared. Sergeant Reeves found her 2 hours after the strike, on the western perimeter wall, standing alone looking out over the jagged peaks where the Gorgon's Pass cut through the mountains like a knife wound. The sun was setting, painting the ice-crusted ridgelines in hues of blood orange and violet. The wind was still a physical force whipping her dark hair around her face, but she seemed oblivious to its bite. In her hands, she held the large smoky quartz vacuum tube, the custom piece she'd used in the Type 9 transmitter. With a soft cloth, she was carefully, methodically cleaning it, polishing the glass until it gleamed in the dying light, wiping down each of the contact pins with deliberate attention. It was a ritual, a quiet moment of communion between warrior and weapon. This simple piece of glass and metal, no bigger than her forearm, weighing perhaps 3 pounds, was more powerful than Morrison's entire sophisticated defense network, more reliable than satellites, more trustworthy than computers, because it was fundamental. Physics that didn't change. Engineering that didn't require updates. Technology that respected the immutable laws of the universe. Reeves approached slowly, stopped a respectful 10 feet away, came to parade rest, his eyes fixed on the horizon, not daring to look at her directly without permission. They stood in silence for a long minute, only the keening wind between them. "The men, ma'am," Reeves finally spoke. His voice was rough but stripped of its earlier casual familiarity. This was a sergeant addressing a general. "Protocol observed. They've been monitoring what's left of enemy communications, intercepting scattered radio traffic." Cortez continued polishing the tube. Patient, thorough. "What's left of their command structure is in complete chaos," Reeves continued. "They're calling it the Sentinel Strike. Some of them think the mountain itself struck them down. Divine intervention." He paused. "They have no idea what actually happened. Just that 12 tanks and 100 men ceased to exist in 3 seconds." Cortez finished polishing. She carefully wrapped the tube in the oil-soaked cloth, placed it back into its lead-lined box with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. "It wasn't a strike, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was calm, even, almost carried away by the wind. "It was a message." She turned to look at him for the first time. Those pale gray eyes holding the weight of command, the burden of the long view that generals carried. A reminder that protocol and readiness are not abstract concepts. They are the only things that stand between order and chaos, between life and death. She looked back at the mountains. This outpost was failing, not because of a lack of courage, not because of inadequate equipment, but because of a lack of discipline, a lack of vigilance. Her words were precise, surgical, each one a scalpel, cutting to truth. Colonel Morrison saw a technician he could bully. Lieutenant Hayes saw a woman he could dismiss. Your soldiers saw a target for their boredom. She paused. None of you saw the weak points in your own defense. The misaligned communications dish was a symptom of a larger disease. "Complacency," Reeves said quietly. "Yes." She turned to face him fully now. "You all survived today, not because of your readiness, but in spite of it. You got lucky that I was here, that I had prepared for exactly this scenario, that I had the training and the authorization to activate systems your generation has forgotten exist." The weight of her words settled on Reeves like a physical burden. "What are your orders, ma'am?" The question was simple, but the meaning was profound. He wasn't asking what tasks to complete. He was ceding command, acknowledging her absolute authority, not just of rank but of competence earned through fire. He was asking her to lead them, to teach them, to make them into what they should have been all along. Cortez looked up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening indigo sky. The air was becoming clearer as the day's wind settled, the temperature dropping toward the lethal ranges that came with night at this altitude. "The enemy knows this pass is vulnerable now," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd studied warfare for 16 years. "They'll be back, not with tanks, they learned that lesson, but with infantry specialists, mountain warfare experts. They will try to reclaim this position." She looked at him directly, command radiating from her like heat. "Colonel Morrison is to be confined to his quarters pending a full review. As of this moment, you are the ranking NCO of this base, Master Sergeant Reeves. You will answer directly to me." Reeves stiffened. "Ma'am, I don't deserve—" "You observed. You questioned your assumptions. You didn't panic when systems failed." Her voice was firm. "And when I needed someone to trust the evidence of their eyes instead of their prejudices, you were the only one who did. That's leadership, Sergeant." She started walking toward the warmth and light of the main compound, her boots leaving sharp, clear prints in the crusted snow. As she passed Reeves, she paused. The drill work begins at 0500, she said without looking at him. I want a full diagnostic on every piece of equipment, starting with the Northwestern actuator arm on the main communications dish. I want patrol routes redesigned, sensor nets recalibrated, backup systems for the backup systems. She took 2 more steps, then added over her shoulder, and I want every soldier on this mountain to be able to field strip their rifle and reassemble it blindfolded, in under 60 seconds, in a blizzard. She didn't wait for a response. She continued walking, a solitary, determined figure disappearing into the growing dusk. Reeves stood alone on the wall for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones despite his insulated gear. He watched her go, then looked back out at the valley where an enemy force had been erased from existence by a woman he'd mistaken for a civilian desk clerk. The air on the mountain felt different now. It was no longer just cold and thin and hostile. It was sharp, electric, charged with a new and demanding purpose. This wasn't punishment. It was a second chance, a chance to become the soldiers they were supposed to be, to meet the standards that had always existed but that comfort and technology had allowed them to ignore. He straightened his shoulders, the weariness of the day replaced by a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Real purpose. He turned and marched back toward the barracks, his stride long and deliberate. He had his orders, and he had 8 hours until 0500 to make sure every man on this base understood that the age of mediocrity was over. The age of General Cortez had begun. Colonel Morrison's quarters were Spartan by choice. He'd always believed that commanders should endure the same hardships as their men. A point of pride, a way of demonstrating his toughness. Now the small room felt like a cell. He sat on his bunk, elbows on knees, head in hands, replaying every interaction, every word, every dismissive gesture. The knock on his door was soft, respectful. Enter. General Cortez stepped inside. She'd changed into a clean uniform, the single star on her collar visible now. No longer hiding, no longer testing, just a general addressing a subordinate. Morrison stood immediately, came to attention, his body executing movements burned into muscle memory over 3 decades. At ease, Colonel. Her voice was neutral, professional. He moved to parade rest but remained standing. She was his superior officer. Protocol mattered now more than ever. She held something in her hand, a document, aged paper in a protective sleeve. Do you know what this is? She asked, handing it to him. Morrison took it carefully, looked at the faded text. His eyes widened as he read. It was a Silver Star citation. For valor in combat, Desert Storm 1991. The recipient, Captain John Morrison, 82nd Airborne Division. His father. Where did you get this? His voice was barely a whisper. Colonel Brennan served with your father in the Gulf. He kept a copy. She paused. He spoke very highly of him, called him one of the finest officers he'd ever known. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he held the document. He'd never seen this. His father had died when Morrison was 8, a training accident in 1980. All Morrison had were fragments of memory and a few photographs. Your father led from the front, Cortez continued. He listened to his NCOs. He valued expertise regardless of where it came from. She met his eyes. He would be ashamed of what you became. The words hit like physical blows. Morrison flinched, but didn't look away. I know, ma'am. Do you, her voice sharpened slightly. Do you understand what you did? You didn't just fail an inspection. You created a culture where competence was dismissed, where critical maintenance was ignored, where warnings were treated as insubordination. She gestured toward the window, toward the base beyond. That communications dish has been misaligned for 6 months. 6 months of degraded signal integrity, 6 months of data delays. Your communications specialist reported it 3 times. You told him to stop bothering you with trivial issues. Morrison closed his eyes. He remembered dismissing the reports as minor technical complaints, remembered being irritated that his people couldn't solve simple problems without running to him. The equipment theft, Cortez continued relentlessly. Master Sergeant Williams noted discrepancies in the inventory 8 months ago. You told him it was probably just paperwork errors. You didn't investigate. Ma'am, I'm not finished, Colonel. Her voice cut like a blade. Your defensive sensor net had 4 blind spots. Your patrol rotations had a 17-minute gap in coverage. Your emergency protocols hadn't been drilled in 14 months. Your backup power systems were never tested under load. Each failure listed, each mistake cataloged, the full accounting of his command. And when crisis came, you panicked. You shouted. You froze. You were useless when your people needed you most. The silence stretched. Morrison stood rigid, feeling the full weight of his inadequacy. "I can end your career with one word to Stratcom," Cortez said quietly. "Sign a single document and you're relieved. Retired. Finished." "I understand, ma'am. I deserve it." "Yes, you do. You." She walked to the window, looked out at the darkened base. "But Colonel Brennan believes you can learn. He thinks you have potential buried under ego and complacency." She turned back to him. "I'm less convinced." "Ma'am, your father's generation fought with what they had. They improvised. They adapted. They respected the fundamentals because they had to." Her voice was hard. "Your generation had everything automated, everything comfortable. You forgot that all technology fails eventually. You forgot the basics because you never needed them." She paused, letting that sink in. "Until today." Morrison swallowed hard. "What happens now, ma'am?" "That depends. Can you learn? Can you genuinely change? Or will you just resent being taught by a woman half your age who proved you incompetent?" The question hung between them. Honest, direct, demanding truth. Morrison thought about his father. About the man he'd never really known but had spent his life trying to honor. About whether his career was worth preserving if it meant continuing to fail the soldiers who depended on him. "I can learn, ma'am. I want to learn." He straightened. "The Corson offensive, 3 years ago. I read the after-action reports. 23 KIA because of command failure." He met her eyes. "You commanded that task force. Those were your soldiers." She didn't blink, didn't look away. "I don't want to be the officer who caused that," Morrison continued. "I don't want other soldiers dying because I was too proud to listen, too arrogant to see my own failures." Cortez studied him for a long moment, looking for sincerity, for genuine understanding. "You're reduced to Major effective immediately. You'll remain at FOB Sentinel under my direct supervision for 6 months. Her voice was formal now, official. "You will learn every system I use today, every analog backup, every emergency protocol. You will study Cold War defensive doctrine. You will learn to lead without computers telling you what to do." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Colonel Brennan will be your primary instructor. You will treat him with the respect his experience deserves. You will listen when he speaks. You will apply what he teaches." She looked back. "And if you succeed, if you demonstrate genuine growth, you might earn your eagles back. But you'll earn them this time, not just receive them." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me, Major Morrison. Prove me right. That's all the thanks I need." She left, the door closing with a soft click. Morrison stood alone, still holding his father's citation, feeling the weight of legacy and the possibility of redemption. He had been given something precious, something most officers never received: a second chance. Whether he deserved it remained to be seen. That night, Colonel Brennan's quarters received a visitor. The old soldier sat in his worn chair, a glass of bourbon beside him. The walls of his small room told the story of a life in service. Photographs spanning 5 decades, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and advisory roles. And one photo that held a place of prominence: a young Lieutenant Cortez, age 19, covered in desert dust, standing beside a younger Brennan in Baghdad, 2008, both of them grinning despite exhaustion. 2 soldiers who'd survived their first war together. The knock was familiar, expected. "It's open." Cortez entered, carrying a bottle. The same bourbon from 16 years ago, a tradition they'd maintained across decades in deployments. "Thought you might want company," she said. "Always got time for you, Rachel. Sit." She poured 2 glasses, handed him one, sat in the chair across from him. For a moment, they just existed in comfortable silence. 2 warriors at rest. "You were hard on Blake," Brennan finally said. "Not accusatory, just observational. He needed hard. Could have destroyed him. One word to Stratcom and he's done." "Yes, but you didn't." Cortez swirled the bourbon in her glass, watched the amber liquid catch the light. You said he could learn. You said his father was a good officer. That counts for something. Brennan smiled slightly. You listened to an old man's opinion. Not many generals do. You taught me to listen to people who've seen more than I have, to respect experience. She looked at him. I'm 34. You're 72. You've earned my attention. He chuckled, a dry, gravelly sound. 72. Christ. When I was 34, I was a lieutenant in the Gulf, still learning which end of the radio to talk into. Liar. You were already teaching me by then. Details. He took a sip, savored it. You know what I remember most about Baghdad, teaching you to use that Type 9 in the green zone? You were so damn frustrated. Wanted to know why we bothered with obsolete equipment. And you told me that obsolete just meant proven. That simple beats complex when complex fails. You remembered. I always remember what you teach me, Jim. They sat quietly, the bourbon warming them from inside, the photographs watching from the walls like ghosts of missions past. How much longer will you stay here? Cortez asked. Brennan shrugged. As long as I'm useful, as long as my hip holds out, as long as someone needs teaching. He paused. Why are you planning to ship me off to some retirement home? Never, but you can't teach forever. Eventually I'll die. Probably on a base somewhere bothering young officers with stories about the old days. He smiled. Could be worse ways to go. There are people who need what you know, Jim, more than just FOB Sentinel. You want me to train the next generation, properly train them. Yes. He considered this. I'm 72 years old. The military doesn't want ancient instructors with bad hips. When the military wants what works, you work. She leaned forward. I'm establishing a training initiative, old school fundamentals for young officers, analog backups, crisis decision-making without computers, leadership under pressure. And you want me to run it. I want you to design it, build it, staff it with people like you who remember when soldiers had to think. She paused. Your generation's knowledge is dying, Jim. When you're gone, who teaches these lessons? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, the weight of that question settling on old shoulders. I taught you, he finally said, and I'll teach others. But I can't be everywhere, can't reach everyone. She met his eyes. I need you. The military needs you. For however many years you've got left. He laughed, not mockery, something warmer. Pride, perhaps. Rachel Cortez, youngest general in American history, and you're asking an old man with a bum hip for help. I'm asking the finest soldier I've ever known to help me save lives, to help me make sure no more Corson offensives happen because commanders forgot the basics. Brennan raised his glass. To the basics, and to those who remember them. She touched her glass to his, to the teachers and the students who listen. They drank, the bourbon burning smooth and warm, a bridge between generations, between wars, between the old ways and the new. Outside, FOB Sentinel hummed with renewed purpose. Engineers worked through the night. Systems came back online. Soldiers drilled despite exhaustion. And in the command center, newly promoted Master Sergeant Reeves briefed junior NCOs on the new protocols, the new expectations, the new reality that competence mattered more than rank, that readiness wasn't optional, that the fundamentals weren't old-fashioned, they were essential. The mountain was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing. 1 week later, the transformation was undeniable. 0500 formation had become sacred. Every soldier assembled regardless of duty status, standing in the brutal pre-dawn cold while General Cortez, now wearing her rank, openly conducted inspection and training. Her speeches were brief, direct, stripped of military jargon and bureaucratic padding. I am Brigadier General Rachel Cortez. I'm 34 years old. Some of you think that's too young, that I haven't earned the right to command. She let that statement hang in the frozen air. I've served 9 combat deployments, 16 years of continuous service. I've been wounded twice, decorated for valor 4 times. I've buried soldiers I trained. She looked across the assembled formation. Young faces and old, privates and sergeants, Men and women who'd been coasting on technology and routine. I've earned my rank in blood. Now you'll earn yours in training. The new regimen was brutal, comprehensive, designed to strip away dependency on systems that could fail. Map reading with compass and protractor. No GPS, no digital displays, just paper and angles and the fundamental math that had guided soldiers since ancient times. Morse code training. Every soldier required to learn basic transmission and reception. Because radios could be jammed, satellites could be destroyed, but a flashlight and knowledge of dots and dashes would work anywhere. Hand crank generator operation and maintenance, vacuum tube theory, field expedient communications. The tools and techniques that had won wars before microchips existed. Colonel Brennan taught many of the classes, his age and his cane-lending authority to lessons about resilience and backup plans, about not trusting single points of failure. During Desert Storm, sand got into everything, he told a group of shivering privates. Electronics failed, batteries died. You know what worked? Good old-fashioned field telephones, wire communication, techniques we'd used since World War I. Because fundamentals don't care about the weather. The soldiers listened, not because they had to, because they'd seen what happened when fundamentals were forgotten. They'd watched their sophisticated base nearly fall to an enemy attack that only antique equipment could defeat. They'd witnessed a woman half Brennan's age save them all using knowledge the old man had taught her 3 decades ago. And they understood finally that age and technology were poor substitutes for competence and preparation. Major Morrison, no longer colonel, those eagles stripped away, worked in the motor pool, hands dirty with grease, learning systems from the ground up. Brennan mentored him separately, patiently rebuilding what arrogance had destroyed. Your father learned humility in the Iraqi desert, Brennan told him one afternoon. Both men rebuilding a generator. Learned that his college degree didn't mean much when equipment failed and men needed leadership. Learned to listen to sergeants who'd forgotten more than he'd ever know. Morrison's hands stilled. Did he struggle with it, the learning? Every good officer does. The bad ones pretend they know everything. The good ones admit they don't and learn. Brennan looked at him. Which kind are you going to be? Morrison resumed work, tightening a connection with care. The kind my father would have been proud of, however long that takes. Then you'll be fine. Lieutenant Hayes never got that chance. The investigation into the equipment theft took 3 days. Master Sergeant Reeves conducted it personally, methodical, and thorough. The evidence was damning. Hayes had been stealing Cold War-era encryption modules and frequency scanners for 8 months, selling them through intermediaries to black market arms dealers, who'd been selling them to the same enemy forces that attacked through Gorgon's Pass. The enemy had known FOB Sentinel's vulnerabilities because Hayes had provided the technical specifications, had known about the solar flare because Hayes had access to the meteorological reports, had timed their attack perfectly because a traitor had given them everything they needed. The arrest was quiet, professional. Hayes offered no resistance. Seemed almost relieved that the deception was over. General Cortez questioned him personally. Why, she asked. Not angry, just seeking to understand. Hayes stared at his hands, cuffed in front of him. Gambling debts. I got in over my head. They said just some old equipment nobody used anymore. That it wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter. Cortez's voice was flat. You gave our enemies the tools to kill American soldiers. You told them when we'd be vulnerable. You betrayed everyone on this base. I didn't think they'd actually attack. I swear I didn't. You didn't think. That's the problem. You took an oath to defend this country, and you sold it for money. She leaned forward. How many soldiers could have died because you needed cash? Hayes had no answer. He was removed from the base under guard. Court-martial pending. Career over. Life effectively finished. Cortez watched him go without expression. Justice served. A threat removed. But no satisfaction. Just the cold recognition that betrayal came from weakness, and that weak men were everywhere waiting for their moment to fail. 3 weeks after the solar flare, Cortez and Brennan stood together on the western perimeter wall, their traditional spot, where important conversations happened. The base had changed, fundamentally, visibly. Patrols moved with purpose. Equipment gleamed from constant maintenance. Soldiers drilled in conditions that would have sent the old FOB Sentinel crew running for heated shelters. The communications dish had been realigned. The blind spots in sensor coverage eliminated. Backup systems tested and retested until everyone could execute emergency protocols in their sleep. Intel says the enemy is regrouping, Brennan said quietly. Let them come. We're ready now. Because of you. Because of you, I'm just passing on what you taught me. Brennan smiled. You're doing more than that. You're building something. A legacy. Cortez pulled out the vacuum tube, the same one she'd used to save the base, held it up to the fading light. You taught me that detail matters. That preparation beats panic. That old reliable beats new fancy. She looked at him. That knowledge doesn't expire just because technology advances. And you proved it at 34. With tools and techniques you taught me when I was 19. They stood in comfortable silence. Two soldiers connected across decades, across ranks, across the vast gulf of experience and age. Jim, when you're gone, she started, when I'm gone, you'll keep teaching. You'll find your own students, your own protégés. He gripped her shoulder. That's how knowledge survives, generation to generation, teacher to student, an unbroken chain stretching back to the first soldier who realized that the smart ones live longer. I won't let the old ways die. I know, that's why I taught you. The sun set behind the mountains. The temperature dropped toward lethal. Stars emerged in crystal clarity. Somewhere out there, enemies planned and prepared. Somewhere threats gathered. Somewhere Murphy's Law waited with infinite patience for the next opportunity to test the unprepared. But on this mountain, on this base, soldiers were ready. They knew how to navigate without satellites, how to communicate without computers, how to think without artificial intelligence doing it for them. They'd learned that technology was a tool, not a crutch, that fundamentals mattered, that the youngest general in American history had saved them with knowledge from one of the oldest soldiers they knew. And they understood finally that age doesn't measure wisdom, experience does. Below them, lights burned in FOB Sentinel, radar dishes aligned perfectly, guard towers manned by alert sentries. A base transformed from complacent to competent, from vulnerable to vigilant, from Morrison's kingdom of ego to Cortez's fortress of readiness. General Cortez looked out at the darkness, at the mountains that held threats and promises, at the responsibility that came with command. She'd come here to test, to audit, to see if commanders could be saved or if they were beyond redemption. She'd found both, had destroyed one career and saved another, had revealed weakness and built strength, and in the process had proven something she'd always known but the military kept forgetting, that competence transcends gender, that preparation defeats prejudice, that the truth doesn't care about your assumptions, it just is. The radio on her belt crackled. Master Sergeant Reeves' voice. General perimeter check complete. All stations green. Base secure. She keyed the mic. Copy that, Master Sergeant. Well done. Thank you, ma'am. 0500 formation as scheduled. Confirmed. Tomorrow we drill on field expedient communications. Total equipment failure scenario. Morse code and signal flags only. Understood, ma'am. The men are ready. She clipped the radio back. Looked at Brennan. They're ready, he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. They're getting there. Because you're teaching them what I taught you. And what will you teach the next generation of instructors? Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Same thing I taught you. That the old ways aren't old, they're proven. That simple beats complex. That fundamentals never expire. Cortez turned to face him fully. I'm going to make sure this generation learns that. And the next. And the one after that. Her voice carried absolute conviction. The chain doesn't break. Not while I'm here. Brennan's expression showed pride. Deep, genuine pride. Then the chain is in good hands. They walked back together, old soldier and young general, moving toward the lights and warmth of the base they'd rebuilt together. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal, silent witnesses to the passing of knowledge, to the transfer of wisdom from those who'd learned in fire to those who'd learned in discipline. The age of Cortez had begun, and the fundamentals would endure.